All right, welcome back to another episode. In our previous episode, we were talking about numbers and new numerical types, specifically the double type, which gave us the ability to have decimal places and fractions. We also talked about the print function, which was our first introduction to a function, and gave a little tour around how the print function actually works and how we can use it to print various numbers to the console. This lesson is going to be a little bit of a different lesson. We're not actually going to write any code that we're going to run or use. So if you're not interested in going deeper on types and learning more about some of the vocabulary options that you're going to need to know just to get better at programming in general, you can skip ahead to the next. But I'm going to recommend that you go ahead and stick around because this will give you at least a head start on things that are going to be coming in future lessons. Also, as always, if you already know how to program, go ahead and skip to episode number 6. Episode number 6 is the one where we actually get down to building an iOS app. And, of course, every single one of these lessons is geared towards people that have no experience programming. So if that's you, you're in the right place. We're going to go ahead and we're going to dive in and we're going to talk about a few additional types. We're going to also talk about something called comments, and then we're hopefully going to have you feeling confident and ready to take on the next set of lessons where we're actually going to start building out what will become our functioning app. Now, if we take a look at this file that we've been working in, we've sort of just been following along and putting the code in this one specific area, and that's because that's the area of code that's going to be run when we run our app. But you'll notice that there's lots of stuff that was generated by the template for us. There's this class word, so you can see class view controller, and view did load has all these override func, which are things that we don't know about. But let's save those for a little bit later. If we go to the very top of our file, we can see something that is actually really interesting here. We see some text that is clearly not meant to be read by a computer, but is meant to be read by a human. And you'll notice the pattern here. Every single line of text starts with 2 backslashes. Now, this is what we call a comment. Now, in code files, obviously, code has to be written in a way so that computers can understand it. But more often than not, it's humans that are going to be reading it, and we need a little context to help humans remember what code we wrote, or maybe this is somebody else's code, and you need help understanding what somebody else's code means. And so what we want to do is we want to have this ability to leave a comment that indicates to the next person that comes along what this code is supposed to be doing so that they don't have to try and actually go through and read every single line and understand every detail to get the gist of what is happening in your code. So let's go ahead and make our own. In this case, we were talking about how to invert a number, which is actually one of the pieces of functionality that our calculator has. So we're going to go ahead and throw a comment right here. Now, it's pretty easy. All you do is you add 2 slashes, and then after you've got 2 slashes, we can go ahead and type our comment. In this case, we're going to type, this code multiplies a number by -1 to invert the sign. So basically, it takes these 4 lines of code and lets us easily sum up what it's supposed to do in a way that is easily read by humans. So the next time we come back to our code, it's easy to read and understand what's happening. You can also, if we come down one more, we got this little block of code here that converts a double to an integer by dropping the fraction. And so that might be something that we don't really remember when we come back here, and we want to make sure that we remember that. So we're going to throw a comment above that too to just remind ourselves the next time we're in our code what this block of code was actually doing, and make it a little easier on ourselves the next time around. Okay, so that's it for comments. You can use comments all over the place, and I suggest you do, and you'll actually see we're going to use some comments throughout our code as we go on through the next tutorials to try to make sure we stay on top of what is happening as our code grows and gets harder and harder to understand. So let's go ahead. Let's delete all of this. We're going to do a nice clean slate, and these are the types that we're going to learn about. Now, these are kind of like vocabulary words. They're things that might not make a lot of sense right now because you're not using them for anything useful, but they're words that you should be aware of exist so you don't feel intimidated in future lessons as we're talking about some of these types and actually using them. So we've already been introduced to the to the integer type, which doesn't allow fractions. And we've also been introduced to the double type, which does allow fractions. Now, we didn't really use, but we did learn about float. And float is basically another way to represent numbers that have decimal places. Now, if you remember a float versus a double, the double has double the amount of accuracy. So if you need something that has a whole lot of decimal places afterwards, then double is what you're going to want. Now, here's the first one that we haven't seen before. Now, we talked about how in programming you can represent all kinds of things, and numbers are just one of those kinds of things. In this case, the thing that we're going to represent is a single character. Now, a character is just something that somebody types. So in our case, we'll go ahead and create a character variable, and it is just the letter C. And you can see you put quotation marks around the single character there, and that indicates that it is a character. Now, one character by itself isn't very useful, and so sometimes you want to string a bunch of characters together. So, of course, the name is string. That's the type. Now, a string represents, like I said, a string of characters all strung together. And you might think of this as words or sentences, but really it's anything that can be typed in. So it could be words, it could be a sentence, it could be a sentence that has numbers in it. Maybe the string is, I have 10 apples. And that is something that is super useful when interacting with humans, because humans are very comfortable with dealing with words. And so string is something that we're going to use a lot. Now, this third new type is something called a Boolean. And this one is something that I personally struggled to understand the value of the very first time I was introduced to it. And it's because Boolean is so simple. The Boolean type just represents true or false. Now, if we create a Boolean variable, we assign it to true. I'm going to throw a comment here that it could also be assigned to false. It just represents true or false. And that seems weird that you're going to have an entire dedicated type to just true or false. But you're going to see as we go through and we're comparing things and we're checking things, we're going to be checking a lot to see, well, is this true or is this not true? And you'll see this come into value later. So that's a Boolean. Now, next is something called nil. And nil was even harder for me to understand the first time I was exposed to it. So nil, also called null in other languages, it represents nothing. And that's a very weird concept. And you can even see that it's a little different from other types. If we go through and we type out, let and assign a variable, and we try to assign nil to a variable, it doesn't let us. And that's because nil assigned directly to a variable doesn't mean anything. You can't have a variable that is nothing. So how do you actually use it? Well, let's give an example here. Let's say I have a variable that is true or false, which is a Boolean, or nothing. So what we do, how we represent that, is we go ahead and we type out true or false or nothing. We assign it, we tell it that it is a Boolean, but we put a question mark afterward. Now, the question mark indicates that this is what they call in Swift is optional. Now, what optional means is that it is either a Boolean, so true or false, or it is nothing. And you can see that we can't just assign anything to it. We can't just assign a number to it. The question mark doesn't mean it's a free-for-all. We can assign this to either be true or false or nil. Again, with nil representing nothing. And that might seem like sort of a weird concept to be able to model nothingness, but you will find several cases where, as we're building things out, that there isn't actually a concrete answer as to what something should be. Or maybe there's a case where somebody's done something wrong, and so it can't be anything. And you'll see some of those. So for now, maybe trust a little bit, but I don't know, maybe here's one more concrete example is, let's say we're letting the user type in their username. And if you've ever signed up for a website, you know that usernames often have some arbitrary restrictions on what you can and can't use for your username. And let's say the user typed in something that's not allowed. So in this case, obviously username would be a string. It's a string of characters, so anything somebody typed in. But we have in our application, sometimes the username that they typed in is not allowed. And so we actually want our program to recognize that. And so what we can do is we can change username to be an optional string and set it to nil, meaning that, the user may have typed something, but we're not accepting it. So for right now, their username is nothing. Now, nothing is different from just a string with no characters in it. It's different from, a lot of other ways that you can think of to model that, oh, hey, the user typed in something incorrect. But for our program, you're going to see it's going to be super valuable in the future to be able to model this idea that something is actually nothing, that this variable has nothing assigned to it. And, if you just want to go ahead, get comfortable again, you can option click on username, and you can see that Xcode recognizes our username variable and that it is not just a normal string, but that it is in fact an optional string. It shows with the question mark there. All right, so that's all for this episode. We talked about some number types as a quick review. We talked about characters. We talked about strings of characters or strings. We talked about Booleans, and we talked about optional types, including nil. Now, on our next episode, we're going to take all of these skills and we're going to start making our own classes and functions and talking about some of the rest of this code that was generated by the template we used. All right, we look forward to seeing you next time.